He was called a demon on four legs, unbreakable, untouchable, and destined for death, until a 73-year-old widow walked into the auction yard and did the unthinkable. The air over Trestle Ridge pulsed with heat, the kind that warped the horizon and turned the land to powder. It hadn't rained in 87 days, not a single drop to soften the cracked ground or ease the ache of cattle standing motionless in sparse shade. Dust rose in lazy spirals behind every truck that rattled toward the auction yard, where wood creaked under decades of boots and desperation. In this part of the country, time didn't pass. It wore through things, fences, families, even hope. And still the auction happened like it always did, every month. People came not because they expected miracles, but because routine felt like safety. There were horses to buy and stories to tell over styrofoam coffee cups, deals made with nods and dry handshakes. But that morning felt different. Tense, charged, like the prairie was holding its breath. Among the sunburnt ranchers, young handlers in scuffed jeans, and the usual crowd of dusty spectators, an old woman stepped out of a faded blue pickup and onto the gravel lot. She wore no hat, no sunglasses. Her cane tapped lightly with each step, and her shoulders hunched not from weakness, but the long habit of bracing herself against a world that rarely made space for her. Iris Caldwell hadn't been to the Trestle Ridge livestock auction in 15 years. Most people there didn't remember her name. A few might have recalled a younger version of her, one who danced at county fairs and rode barrels like wildfire. But the woman they saw now looked like someone folded by time in quiet sorrow. Her braid hung over her shoulder, the color of fog and ash. Her boots were cracked. She carried no purse, only a satchel slung over one arm and a piece of red cloth tied carefully around her wrist. She walked straight toward the edge of the pens, without so much as glancing at the crowd. Inside the farthest corral stood the reason people had arrived early and lingered long. A black Mustang, stocky and scarred, paced like a storm in a bottle. His name was Rogue, 6 years old, unbroken, and impossible. The handlers spoke of him in hushed voices. He had kicked down reinforced steel, sent 4 men to the hospital, 2 with broken ribs, 1 with a concussion, and the last with nothing but bruises and a new fear of horses. Even from a distance, Rogue radiated fury. His coat gleamed with sweat, though the day was still young, and foam slicked the corners of his mouth. A deep groove wrapped around his neck where ropes had burned through skin. He reared every time someone came near, crashing into the panels with the kind of strength that didn't just threaten, it promised. Iris stopped beside the corral, resting both hands atop her cane. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just watched. A young, stable hand, no more than 20, edged toward her. His face was sun-reddened and uncertain. "Ma'am, you might not want to stand too close. He's mean." Iris's voice was soft, steady. "He's scared." The boy hesitated. "They say he's dangerous. Ain't no one been able to get near him. Last buyer sent him back in 12 hours. Still breathing?" she asked without looking at the boy. "Barely." She gave a small nod. "That counts for something." People trickled into the bleachers as the auctioneer began his warm-up. Bids flew for the first few lots: an Appaloosa mare, a pair of draft colts, a paint pony with crooked legs. Buyers gestured, murmured, sipped iced lemonade under straw hats. Life moved on, predictable and ordinary. But Iris sat apart from the crowd. She claimed a seat in the back row, shaded only by the brim of a nearby man's cowboy hat. Her fingers fidgeted with the red cloth at her wrist. The piece of fabric had once belonged to a man she loved, her late husband, Gerald. He used to tie it around his arm before every rodeo, every war protest, every difficult moment when courage had to come from somewhere outside of him. Now it was hers. As the auction wore on, she kept her gaze fixed on the closed gate at the far side of the ring, the one Rogue waited behind. Each horse sold was just one step closer to something she hadn't quite explained to herself. She didn't come that day with a plan, only a feeling. Then the shift came. A whisper moved through the crowd like a tremor beneath the boards. "Here he comes." The handlers opened the gate with all the hesitance of men unready for what followed. Rogue charged into the arena, not walking, not running, but fighting. He slammed against the wall, sent one of the handlers spinning to the dirt. The other barely held on to the lead line, which snapped seconds later. The auctioneer took a step back, microphone trembling in his hand. Lot 47, 6-year-old Mustang, unbroken. Strong bloodline, solid build, not recommended for inexperienced handlers. No one moved. A silence so thick it could suffocate settled over the crowd. Opening bid $500, the auctioneer called. Nothing. 400, still nothing. Rogue's flanks heaved. His hooves sent clumps of dust into the air. 3, a child whimpered. A woman pulled her toddler close. Somewhere near the snack stand, a man muttered, "He's a devil horse. Ought to be put down." Then came the voice. 200. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the quiet like a bell in a church service. Heads turned. Some stood. Iris Caldwell didn't rise. She didn't shout. She just raised her hand, trembling slightly but sure, and spoke her bid again. 200. The auctioneer blinked. 200 from the back. Do I hear 250? Silence. 250. No, sold for $200 to the lady in the back row. Murmurs burst like static. Someone laughed. Someone else hissed through his teeth, "She's lost her damn mind." But Iris stood, adjusted the cloth on her wrist, and made her way back down the bleachers with slow, deliberate steps. At the corral, Rogue was rearing again, smashing into the gate. The handlers looked like they'd seen ghosts. No one tried to stop her as she approached. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the red cloth, untied it from her wrist, held it in both hands. She extended it over the fence, no sudden movements, no words. Rogue paused. Just a flicker of stillness. His front hooves dropped. His head turned slightly. The crowd behind her quieted. Iris whispered something that no one could hear but the horse, and Rogue blinked. He didn't walk forward, didn't drop his head, but for that one breath of time, he didn't attack the world either. He watched, and it was enough. Later, as Rogue was led reluctantly, violently into a battered trailer, with a ramp groaning under his weight, Iris climbed into the driver's seat of her old pickup, turned the key, and rumbled slowly out of the lot. People watched the truck until it vanished beyond the crest of a low hill. Most shook their heads, a few scoffed. One man spat in the dirt and muttered, "She won't last the night." But Iris didn't hear them. And even if she had, she wouldn't have cared. Because deep inside that trailer wasn't just a dangerous horse, it was a question, and Iris Caldwell was finally ready to answer it. The road back to Iris Caldwell's ranch was long, uneven, and mostly forgotten. It wound between hills scarred by drought, where barbed wire fences sagged like tired shoulders, and thistles bloomed in defiance of everything. Her truck rattled with age, coughing, as it climbed the last stretch to the faded wood gate. The trailer behind it groaned with each bump but stayed steady, just like the woman driving it. She didn't speak to the horse inside. She didn't glance into the mirror. She only gripped the wheel with both hands, knuckles, wide eyes fixed forward. The weight in the trailer was more than a wild Mustang. It was the burden of memory, of silence, of things never said, and moments never reclaimed. When Iris parked beside the barn, the sun was already slipping behind the hills. Shadows stretched long over the dusty corral, where broken fence posts leaned like bent knees. Her home was barely more than a framed tin roof, chipped siding, and a single porch light that flickered when it felt like it. But it had stood the test of time. Like her. She opened the trailer's gate without ceremony. Rogue didn't charge out. He stood inside, black and gleaming breath, loud in the stillness. His eyes scanned everything, the open sky, the windmill creaking in the breeze, the woman standing just out of reach. Iris didn't coax him. She stepped back and waited. And after a minute, Rogue stepped down. Each hoof landed like a decision. He looked around, muscles tense but didn't bolt. She led him to the corral, an enclosure barely able to contain him. The gate squealed when it closed behind him. He circled immediately, testing boundaries, snorting like the air itself was an enemy. Iris stood outside the fence for a long while, watching. That night, she didn't turn on the porch light. She sat by the window instead, sipping from a chipped mug of tea and staring out into the dark. In the corral, Rogue paced. She could hear him even when she couldn't see his hooves scraping the occasional thud of him, pressing against the boards. He didn't want to be there, but he didn't try to leave either. Not yet. She spoke for the first time as the stars broke through the clouds. "You're not the first storm I've known," she murmured. No reply came. Only the wind shifting in the trees. In the morning, she walked to the edge of the corral with a folding chair and a thermos of coffee. She didn't enter. She didn't even approach. She just sat. Rogue eyed her from across the fence, snorted once, and kept pacing. She returned the next day, and the day after. No ropes, no commands, just her presence. The fourth day, she brought a book, read out loud. Her voice was dry and low, worn down by years and smoke and grief, but she read anyway. Rogue stood farther away than before, still wary but still listening. Days bled into one another like brushstrokes in the same painting. Mornings were always quiet, afternoons stretched long, and every evening she lit a single lantern by the fence, a flickering dot in the dark like a signal from a lighthouse to a ship that refused to come ashore. She told stories not to the horse, but for herself. She spoke of Gerald, her late husband, and how he used to sing off-key while making pancakes. How he'd built this house board by board after returning from the war hands, trembling but stubborn. How he'd died just after planting wildflowers by the fence that never quite took. Then she spoke of Jacob. Her son had been a soldier too. Came back from Afghanistan with a stare that didn't blink right and a silence that filled whole rooms. She tried everything, words, doctors, prayer, but none of it reached him. One morning he packed a duffel bag and left. That was 14 years ago. He hadn't called. She still checked the mailbox every Friday. Rogue too had that silence in his eyes. That same tightness in the shoulders, the readiness to bolt. It wasn't aggression, it was armor. "You remind me of him," she whispered one evening, her hand resting on the fence post. Always watching the door, always expecting the worst. The next morning, Rogue stood closer. Not close enough to touch, but closer. Iris said nothing. She just nodded once and sat down in her chair with the thermos warming her hands. She began humming. Not a song anyone would know, just a sound low and steady, like water in a creek winding its way through stone. By the second week, Rogue no longer reacted when she moved her chair, when she stood, when she poured water into the trough. He watched, yes, but without alarm. Cal Everett showed up around the third week. His government-issued truck kicked up a storm of dust before sputtering to a stop near the barn. He stepped out in boots too clean for a real rancher, with a notepad tucked into his back pocket and suspicion in his eyes. "Miss Caldwell," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard you bought the demon horse." "I heard they called him that," she replied, not rising from her chair. Cal scanned the corral. "Just came to make sure you weren't, dead. You're late if that was your fear." He chuckled, then glanced at Rogue, who stood still, nostrils flaring but unmoved. "You know he put a trainer in the ICU in El Paso? I know people get scared when they don't understand something." Cal shoved his hands in his pockets and stayed longer than he meant to. Watched as Iris reached into her bag and took out an old red cloth. She tied it loosely to the post again. Rogue's ears twitched. "You got a plan?" Cal asked. "No," Iris said simply. "Just time." After that, Cal came more often, sometimes with hay, sometimes with a spare part for the windmill, sometimes just with silence. Rogue got used to his presence too, though it was clear the trust was only for Iris. Cal respected that. One cold morning, Iris walked into the corral for the first time. No halter, no lead. Just her and the red cloth now tied around her wrist again. She walked slow, each step deliberate. Rogue stiffened, flanks tight. She didn't reach for him, didn't speak. She stopped a few feet away, dropped the halter onto the dirt. "That's yours," she said. "I'm not here to use it, just want you to see it." He didn't run, didn't bolt, just stared. She backed away. The next day, the halter was in a different place, nudged by a hoof. Iris smiled, didn't say a word. It wasn't obedience, it was acknowledgement. Over time, the space between them grew smaller. She could stand beside him now. He didn't flinch when she touched his side. When she brushed his coat, he leaned slightly, not submission, but acceptance. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like light seeping under a door. Sometimes Cal sat with her in the evenings watching Rogue graze in the setting sun. "He's changed," Cal said one night. "No," Iris replied, rubbing her fingers over the red cloth. "He's just remembering who he was before the world told him to be afraid." There were setbacks, of course. One stormy night, a clap of thunder sent Rogue rearing against the corral. Another morning, he bit at her sleeve, startled by the sound of a drop bucket. But Iris never raised her voice, never stepped back, only waited, always returned, always stood her ground. One afternoon, a school group drove by on a field trip. The bus stopped when they saw the Mustang near the fence standing calmly beside a woman old enough to be their great-grandmother. The teacher waved. Iris raised her thermos. A boy leaned out the window and shouted, "Is he magic?" Iris smiled. "No," she said. "He just remembered he wasn't a monster." And as the bus pulled away, Rogue flicked his ears, stared after it like a dream. In time, the townspeople began to talk. The whispers shifted from doubt to wonder, from mockery to questions. And Rogue stood under that changing sky, unbridled, not broken. Beside the woman who hadn't tamed him, but had simply believed in something nobody else would. And that made all the difference. The summer deepened over Trestle Ridge, and with it came a quieter kind of heat, the kind that didn't scorch but settled deep in the bones, and made everything feel slow and stretched thin. The air was thick with the smell of dry hay, pine and dust. On Iris Caldwell's ranch, time was no longer measured in hours or days, but in subtle shifts, in how close Rogue stood, in how often his ears turned toward her voice, in how much stillness lingered between them. Rogue was no longer pacing the corral like a captive storm. He walked now not aimlessly, but with something like purpose. His body remained powerful, rippling with a tension that never fully left, but there was softness at the edges now. He watched Iris with eyes that held less fear and more curiosity. Sometimes he followed her from one end of the fence to the other. Not always, but enough. The halter still lay untouched most mornings, exactly where she left it, draped over the lower fence rail, like a question waiting to be answered. He had sniffed it once months ago, then nudged it, then ignored it for weeks. Iris never pushed. She let it be. One early morning, as the sky still held that pale blue promise of quiet, Iris opened the gate to the corral with the halter in her hand. She wasn't trying to catch him. She just wanted to be near. Rogue lifted his head the moment the latch clicked. His ears twitched, but he didn't back away. She walked slowly, every step deliberate. Her knees were stiff, her balance not what it once was, but she moved with the same steadiness she always had. She didn't look him in the eye, not directly. She knew better. That kind of stare, when forced, could feel like a challenge. Instead, she lowered herself with a grunt to crouch on the dry earth, laying the halter down in front of her. "I'm not here to break you," she said softly. "I just want you to see it. That's all." Rogue stepped closer, one hoof then another. His breath huffed from his nostrils in short, wary bursts. The halter remained still. Iris didn't move, didn't flinch. His nose came within inches of it before he stepped back again. Then he stood, watching her. Not afraid, not trusting, but considering. By noon, the halter was still there. But Iris smiled anyway. "Close enough for today," she murmured. Cal Everett arrived later that week with a roll of fencing in the back of his truck and a fresh thermos of coffee. He didn't knock anymore, just came and went like a fixture of the land itself. "She's got you wrapped around her finger, huh?" he asked Rogue with a grin as the horse stared at him from under the cottonwood tree. Or maybe the other way around. Iris rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. She'd stopped explaining herself weeks ago. People who wanted to understand didn't need convincing, and those who didn't, well, they weren't worth the breath. Sometimes Cal stayed for hours. They sat on the porch, mugs in hand, watching the corral, as if waiting for a prophecy to reveal itself. "He's changed," Cal said one evening, the light slanting low across the hills. "No," Iris replied, her voice even. "He's remembering who he was before someone taught him to be afraid." The next milestone came in the form of apples. It was a slow day, thick heat and no wind, and Iris had wandered toward the barn when she felt a presence behind her. Not the heavy stomp of approach, but the awareness of being watched. She turned. Rogue stood just 10 feet away, ears forward, head tilted slightly. "Well now," she said softly. "Took you long enough." He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. That afternoon, for the first time, he allowed her to brush his mane. Not long, not perfectly, but long enough to gather dust from his coat and leave behind a moment of peace neither of them fully understood. The next few weeks moved like watercolor across paper, blended indistinct but beautiful in motion. Rogue learned to tolerate the pressure of a saddle blanket. He flinched once but didn't rear. On another day, a clap of thunder sent him careening into the gate. Iris waited out the storm beside him, drenched and shivering, but calm. No commands, no ropes, just her presence. One morning, a rusted pickup pulled up the driveway and parked crooked near the barn. A man stepped out, a stranger with a leather hat and tired eyes. He walked with a limp and carried a bundle under one arm. Iris stepped onto the porch. "You the lady with the horse?" he asked. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Rick," he said, adjusting his stance. "I train trauma animals, therapy horses mostly. Heard there's something special going on out here." Iris narrowed her eyes. You heard from who town's small, rumors grow legs. She exhaled slowly. You here to offer advice or judgment? Neither, Rick said. I just wanted to see for myself. He stayed for half an hour, watched as Iris walked the perimeter of the corral rogue, trailing a respectful distance behind. The horse didn't approach Rick, but he didn't bolt either. You're not training him, Rick finally said. You're healing with him. Iris shrugged. Same thing some days. He nodded, left without asking anything more. The next day, a boy from the neighboring ranch showed up. No more than 10, carried a bucket of nails and a hammer too heavy for him, said his mom told him it was polite to help. He sat on the fence afterward, legs swinging, watching Rogue with wide eyes. He doesn't look angry, the boy said. Not anymore, Iris replied. Why? Because no one's trying to fight him. The boy thought about that for a long time. Then he smiled and asked if he could come back next week. The community that once muttered behind her back now lingered at the edge of her land. They didn't ask questions. They brought things: hay, apples, water troughs, tools. And when they left slowly, like they didn't want to miss anything. One afternoon, while repairing a broken section of fence, Iris heard the soft scrape of hooves behind her. She turned slowly. Rogue stood at the base of the porch steps, his head tilted, ears flicking. He had come looking for her. Her breath caught. She let the hammer fall to her side and smiled. Well, she said, you've gone and made a habit of me. He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. That night he slept outside the barn just yards from the porch. No gate, no tether, free, but choosing to stay. The next week, a letter came in the mail delivered by hand by the mayor's assistant, a girl who had once laughed at the idea of an old woman and a demon horse. We'd like to invite you to participate in the county fair, the letter read. Special exhibition, community interest. Iris nearly laughed. She read the letter twice before folding it and placing it on the kitchen counter. Cal found it later. You should go. He's not a trick pony, Iris said. It's not about tricks, Cal replied. It's about showing people what patience can do. She thought about it for days, watched Rogue move across the corral like a shadow she could finally follow. Remembered the child who said he wasn't angry, the man who said she wasn't training but healing, the silence that once held nothing, now full of something she couldn't name. Eventually, she tied the red cloth back around her wrist and whispered, let's show them. Not because she wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because what they had was no longer just for them. It was something others needed to see. That wounds could close, that storms could still, that even the wildest things could choose love over fear, and that sometimes when you stop trying to fix what's broken, it heals in ways you never expected. The morning of the Ridge County Fair arrived, bathed in golden wind. Flags fluttered on fences and poles, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue above the grounds. A line of trucks filled the grass lot, and the smell of kettle corn mingled with dust and the sharp scent of livestock. There was excitement in the air, cheerful and chaotic, but also something quieter, something reverent, as if everyone knew they were about to witness something they couldn't explain. Behind the main arena, in a small holding area shaded by a canvas canopy, Iris Caldwell stood next to Rogue. The Mustang's coat shimmered in the sunlight, each muscle under his skin finely tuned and alert. But he wasn't afraid. His hooves moved deliberately, calm and sure. He wore no saddle, no bit, just a simple rope at his side and a red cloth tied around Iris's wrist. She patted his flank, her touch light and familiar. Her boots were worn soles, nearly smooth, but she stood tall beside the horse, her back straighter than it had been in years, her chin lifted with quiet resolve. A soft murmur rolled through the stands as the announcer's voice cracked over the loudspeaker. Our next entry, well, folks, you might have heard of them already. A low laugh passed through the crowd, mixed with a rising hush. Miss Iris Caldwell and a Mustang by the name of Rogue. The gate swung open. Iris led Rogue into the arena, not like a handler, but like a partner. She didn't pull the rope. She held it loosely, a suggestion rather than a command. Rogue walked beside her, his ears flicking in rhythm with the cheers and gasps that broke across the crowd. They stopped in the center of the ring. For a moment, everything stilled. Iris dropped the rope. A collective breath caught in the audience. Then, without a sound, she raised one hand and gave a single, subtle gesture. Rogue responded. He backed up 2 steps, turned gracefully, circled her once, then halted. The crowd sat frozen. No one clapped. Not yet. They were too mesmerized to remember how. She moved again this time, a low whistle from the corner of her mouth. Rogue pivoted, trotted around the arena in a wide arc, then returned to her side. There were no cues visible to the naked eye, nothing theatrical. What was happening in front of them defied the usual mechanics of control and obedience. This was not domination. This was conversation. Iris placed her hand gently against his shoulder. Rogue nuzzled her elbow in return, and the crowd erupted. Applause filled the arena, not with fanfare, but with something else: relief, awe, gratitude. They had not come to be entertained. They had come, whether they realized it or not, to believe. After the exhibition, people waited near the fence lines, hoping to catch a word, a photo, a closer look. But Iris wasn't there for interviews. She brushed Rogue down behind the stable tent while the announcer moved on to the next event. Her breath came slower now, her limbs aching from the adrenaline and effort. But her heart was full. A girl approached. She was maybe 20, in jeans and a soft flannel shirt, her eyes rimmed in red. She carried a phone but didn't lift it. "My brother came back from Iraq," she said, voice barely above the breeze. "He hasn't spoken to anyone in months. But he watched you two just now and," he cried, "said he didn't know why. Just, said it felt like hope." Iris said nothing at first. Then she took the girl's hand and held it for a long, quiet moment. "That's all it takes," she whispered. "Just a little hope." That night back at the ranch, the stars were sharper than usual. The air had a different kind of stillness, like the land was listening. Rogue stood just beyond the porch, grazing under the cottonwood tree, as if nothing had changed, as if he hadn't transformed the way people believed in what was possible. Iris watched him from the steps, a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "I think you're ready," she said aloud, though there was no one else around to hear. The next morning, she loaded him into the trailer one last time. Cal drove. He didn't ask questions. They wound through back roads and forgotten dirt paths, climbing higher into the hill country, where the Bureau of Land Management had fenced off thousands of acres of open wilderness. No boundaries, no expectations, just space. When they reached the clearing, Iris stepped out first. The sun was rising slowly, casting long shadows across the field. Pine and sage brushed the wind, and the air smelled clean, in a way that only untamed land ever could. She opened the trailer gate. Rogue stepped down slowly, ears turning head high. He paused beside her. She held the rope lightly for a moment more. Then she unclipped it. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with the weight of what she was letting go. The rope dropped to the dirt. For a breath, nothing happened. Then Rogue ran. Not away, not blindly, but freely. His legs stretched, his mane flying like a banner in the wind, and his body moved as if it had always belonged to the horizon. Iris watched without blinking, throat tight. He didn't look back. But he didn't need to. She hadn't brought him here to return to her. She'd brought him here to return to himself. Cal came to stand beside her. He didn't speak for a while. "Think he'll come back?" he finally asked. "I don't know," she answered honestly. But that's not the point. They set up camp nearby that night. A fire crackled low between them, and the stars above pressed in bright and still. "I spent so long thinking I had nothing left to give," Iris said, her voice hushed. "Turns out I just needed something wild enough to need me." Cal nodded. "Funny, isn't it? People think strength is about holding on, but sometimes it's knowing when to let go." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The following days passed with a quiet emptiness. The ranch was not lonely, but it was quiet. Iris busied herself mending old tack oiling tools, sweeping the barn, clearing weeds along the fence line. But every sound in the distance, every shadow near the edge of the pasture pulled her attention. She told herself not to expect anything, but hope, as always, had a will of its own. Then one gray morning, swollen with the scent of coming rain, she heard it, the unmistakable thunder of hooves beyond the property line. She stepped onto the porch, hands trembling at her sides. Rogue stood just beyond the pasture fence. He was muddied flanks, streaked with dust but whole, and he wasn't alone. Beside him stood a chestnut mare with a crooked blaze down her forehead. Behind her, a foal, spindly-legged and bright-eyed, barely old enough to stand steady. They watched her, alert but not wary. Rogue stepped forward first. She opened the gate. He walked through as if he'd never left. The others followed, cautious but curious. The foal sniffed her hand and pressed a soft muzzle into her palm. Cal arrived minutes later, drawn by nothing but instinct. He saw the horses, then the look on her face, and laughed. "Looks like he brought company. He brought a future," she said quietly. She knelt and brushed her hand along the foal's shoulder. The mare lowered her head, breathing warm against Iris's arm. Rogue stood just beyond them, sentinel and still. Later that day, Iris and Cal walked the pasture together. They talked little. Instead, they began opening old fence lines, clearing brush, unfastening latches. Not to let something escape, but to make space. "I thought taming him would be the end," Iris said, as she watched the 3 horses move as one across the field. "But it wasn't about taming, was it?" Cal shook his head. It never was. By dusk, the pasture stretched open all the way to the hills. No fences, no barriers. Iris leaned on the last gate, watching the horses disappear into the tall grass. "Go on," she whispered. "Live." Rogue flicked his tail. The foal bounded forward and the mare followed. Together they vanished into the golden haze of evening. When they were gone, Iris turned and walked back toward the barn. Cal walked beside her, carrying the halter, empty and no longer needed. The barn's shadow reached long across the yard as the sun dipped low. Iris stopped at the door and turned once more toward the open land. There were no lines, no borders, just the wide, breathing promise of what might come next. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt whole. Not because she had held on, but because she had let go. The story of Iris Caldwell and the untamable Mustang named Rogue is not just about a woman and a horse. It's about healing. It's about what happens when you choose patience over pressure, understanding over fear, and presence over control. From the cracked earth of Trestle Ridge to the open pastures beyond the hills, Iris didn't try to conquer Rogue, she listened to him. She saw in him what others failed to recognize, not a threat, but a reflection of pain and potential. And in doing so, she unearthed her own strength, her own grief, her own need for connection. Iris was not a trainer in the traditional sense. She didn't come with ropes or bridles or expectations. She came with silence, time, and a red cloth tied around her wrist, a symbol of love lost, and now of love rediscovered. Rogue, in all his fury and fear, mirrored the brokenness Iris had carried for decades, wounds left by war, by abandonment, by the kind of quiet loneliness that settles deep in the bones of the forgotten. And yet together they built something extraordinary. Each step Rogue took toward her was a small miracle. Each time he stayed instead of bolting, each moment he allowed her to stand beside him or touch his mane, he was choosing trust. And so was she. When she let go of the rope in that arena, when she opened the trailer gate into the wild, when she unclipped the halter and whispered, "Go on." Live, she wasn't losing him. She was honoring what they had created together. In the end, Rogue returned, but not as property, not as a prize. He returned as a partner with a mare at his side and a foal just beginning to find its legs. He brought not closure, but continuation, a future Iris never dared to imagine. Through him, she didn't just reclaim the broken pieces of her past. She discovered that love in its purest form is never about keeping. It's about freeing. The deeper lesson: sometimes the most powerful relationships in our lives are not the ones we control, but the ones we nurture with patience and presence. Whether it's a child struggling with anxiety, a friend carrying invisible burdens, or even ourselves in moments of fear, we all need space to remember who we are. We need people like Iris who don't try to fix us, but simply stand beside us long enough for healing to begin. In today's world where everything moves fast and validation often feels temporary, the story of Iris and Rogue reminds us of a timeless truth. Real connection is never rushed. It's earned over time with quiet consistency and unconditional grace. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love or someone you used to be, let it linger in your heart. And more than that, let it shape the way you walk with others. Sometimes the most meaningful thing we can do is sit quietly by someone's corral day after day until they feel safe enough to step closer. If you found meaning in this story, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating heartfelt, thought-provoking content like this. We have more stories coming, true stories of resilience, healing, and the kind of quiet courage that often goes unseen. So please click subscribe and join us in exploring what it truly means to be human and to walk beside the wild without fear.